welcome to today's program, When Disinformation Meets Election 2020, Becoming an Informed Citizen. Our discussion today will center on the spread of false information and how this could jeopardize our democracy. The better we understand how disinformation is created, disseminated, and consumed, the better we will be able to defend ourselves and others from being misled. Our speakers today are Jevin West and David Nelson. Jevin West is the director of the Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington. He is also an associate professor in the University of Washington iSchool. David Nelson is the editor of the Kitsap Sun and has been with that publication for over 13 years. The League of Women Voters was founded over 100 years ago in the days of the women's suffrage movement. We envision a democracy where everyone has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the confidence to participate. We are nonpartisan, but always working on vital issues of concern to members of the public. The League welcomes both men and women to join. With that, let me hand it over to David and Jevin.
Thanks for the introduction. And again, I'm David Nelson. I'm the editor of the Kitsap Sun here in Bremerton. And we're so grateful that Jevin West from the University of Washington is joining us for this conversation today. And we thank the League of Women Voters for setting it up. Jevin, you and I talked last, in 2019, you came over to Olympic College and we did a forum to start talking about this issue. And obviously it's still vitally important, if not more so, with an election coming up. A lot of the news you read about social media platforms and some questions over the tactics and algorithms used there. So I think this is really good to get a chance to talk about it a little. The first kind of thing I thought I'd ask you to explain. The title of our presentation mentions disinformation, and talk to us real quickly about the terms disinformation versus misinformation, and maybe even versus the fake news, the one that gets thrown around a lot. How do you look at those words and kind of set up that to get into the rest of this conversation?
Absolutely. And first of all, it's great to talk to you again, David. I remember that event very clearly. It was a super productive conversation, and I'm glad that we're following up. And I wish the problem would have gone away, but like you said, it's even more important today than it probably even was then, and it was important then. So it's important when talking about these concepts to think about what the definitions are. And the real distinguisher between at least misinformation and disinformation is in intention. So disinformation involves intentional misleading information, whereas misinformation can arise through honest mistake or through misinterpretation. And that happens a lot. In fact, when we track these things in our new center at the University of Washington devoted to this topic, we find that a lot of it really is through honest mistake. And that's the kind of thing that we can improve in as consumers of information and as producers of information. But it's this nefarious type of misleading information, this disinformation, this intentional misinformation that is concerning, and we're seeing more and more of it that are run through either bots or bad state actors or propagandists or opportunists trying to just make money off of fake news. And that was the third term you had mentioned. We don't use fake news as much. We tend to use misinformation and disinformation more, partly because fake news carries a very charged term with it. It means different things to different people and to different leaders. And so we tend not to use it, but certainly people know when they hear what fake news is, somewhat what it is. And it certainly lies in that same kind of category.
And I guess that leads me to the next question, because we hear these terms a lot, and no newspaper, even ours, we are not perfect. There are mistakes made in news. There are stories that upon first reporting, you don't get it complete and you need the second round of reporting or third version. What have you observed in terms of how quickly those things spread versus an error in a story versus something that is intended to deceive us? Is there any difference? Do you see those going viral more often than another, or how we're watching for those things?
Well, it's a great question, and it's hard to quantify because there's so much of it out there, and it's hard to know if you've fully sampled the population or at least evenly sampled the population of disinformation and mistakes and which ones go more viral. But I can give you my anecdotal interpretation to all this. To me, more often, the disinformation travels further, partly because it's designed to go viral. It's designed to move as far as it can across the social media spheres. Whereas mistakes in newspapers, and they do happen, everyone makes mistakes. I teach classes on misinformation, and I make mistakes all the time too. Really, it comes down to newspapers and mature journalistic venues to admit mistakes, to not double down, to admit mistakes, to list retractions and to show when those mistakes happen. But what we have found with pretty solid evidence, when we do track these issues, the actual disinformation or misinformation almost always travels further than the correction. I mean, and by orders of magnitude many times. And so when misinformation around COVID or around some new policy or around some news story goes out and it turns out to be wrong, sometimes there are corrections by the news sources and TV or whoever put it out, or a social media influencer. And that's great. That's a good step. But even then, it almost never travels as far as the rumor itself. So that's what we're contending with. So when they get out there, things spread so fast that it's hard to set up those corrections.
And what is it about the, and I think you're pointing at social media a lot here. I don't know if there's a difference between types of platforms people are using, whether Facebook makes it more conducive than Twitter would or anything like that. But what is it about social media in general? Because disinformation has existed forever. 150 years ago, the Rocky Mountain News was telling people there's a lake in Denver to sell real estate. It is part of the human condition. But what is it that in today's day and age, and maybe particularly this year with an election cycle that's very hyped up, what is it, do you think, that's catching people's attention that allows that to happen?
Well, it's partly the tool itself. So social media has been and is designed with one objective, and that's user engagement. That's your eyeballs. It wants to glue your eyeballs to the platform for as long as possible, because the longer you're glued to the platform, the more ads that you might possibly click in and the more money they make. And the leaders of these companies know that. They're not going to deny that that's not their main objective. They know that's their main objective. And when you have a system that's been optimized over this time period, over a decade now, far over a decade, it does it pretty darn good. In fact, they know more, the algorithms and these A/B experiments that are going on every millisecond, trying to tap into human psychology and to see which phrases and ideas and colors and images and memes you're more likely to click on. Once it's optimized on that, that's what it cares about. So when it's essentially meant to spread things. And so the technology is there. And so when things go out that catch our attention, and man bites dog is the kind of thing that captures your attention more than than dog bites man, those kinds of things, those sensational stories, those stories that are sort of out of the ordinary, that really likely aren't true, that are too bad or too good to be true, those are the ones that spread. And we see it locally too here. There was this great article in the Seattle Times that was written about a colleague of mine, Dean Miller, who now works at Live Stories. It does a lot of fact checking for things that they find on Facebook. And there was one post from a Woodinville resident. It was a post that was not correct. It was claiming that there were only 9,000 deaths due to COVID, and CDC was finally admitting it. They weren't admitting it. They were just noting that 9,000 of those deaths were only due to COVID rather than comorbidities, which are ailments caused by COVID. So, I may die of a heart condition caused by COVID, but if they list heart condition, it's not only by COVID, even though it is by COVID. That swept through social media so fast and then was amplified by a big QAnon influencer, and that reached all the way to the leader of the free world. And so that's how fast the things can spread. That this great example of that there's lakefront property in Denver. Oh, by the way, I think it's cool. You can have your dog up here. I think it's good. That kind of stuff spread, and still that sort of appeals to the human condition, that we like to hear sort of fanciful stories and things that sort of seem out of the ordinary. But the technology wasn't there to spread at the scale and the speed that it can today.
You mentioned QAnon in that last comment. I think some people would be familiar with that term by now, but maybe define it real quickly for if we have viewers who don't know what that is, and explain maybe a little bit, because I'm not an expert on this either, what it is and why it's so dangerous right now in terms of information.
It's so dangerous, partly because, well, first of all, it's founded on really pretty, I would say, kind of crazy ideas. And it arose around 2017. It was related to Pizzagate. For those that don't remember Pizzagate was this conspiracy theory that Hillary Clinton and associates were running a child sex ring in a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. Now, this was fully debunked, and even those who believed it came, Edgar Welch, who came blasting in with a gun to try to save these children, found that it wasn't true as well. But the idea here is that the world is being run by these Illuminati that are Satan worshipers and child sex slave owners that are, there's different incarnations of it, but that are taking blood from children, and it's being run by, leaders, global leaders, and Hollywood stars and things like that. And it's really caught fire. It almost went away, but then it had a resurgence in 2018 because 3 or 4 influencers on 4chan and some YouTube makers really started creating higher quality videos of it, spread it. They were making money from it. You see a lot of the t-shirts at some of these protests with Q on it. And so then it got a resurgence. And then certainly during this particular time of uncertainty during the pandemic, and of course the election, it's really had a resurgence and brought other conspiracy theory groups together around this. And they've done things like kind of hijack the Save the Children hashtag on Twitter. And who doesn't want to save children? And it is an issue. Of course, human trafficking is a real issue. But what they've done is they've hijacked it as if it's theirs and that's their cause. And it's really taken away from resources and attention from real organizations that are dealing with this particular problem. But it's so dangerous because it's founded on such, really preposterous kinds of ideas, and yet it's reached over 70 countries now. There's been protests around the world, physical protests with people showing up with Q shirts, and it's pretty disturbing that kind of idea and group has reached even mainstream. And so this is the reason why it's concerning, is that if that can reach all the way to mainstream, then it what else can't? And so that's what's concerning to me.
You mentioned these protests around the globe, and obviously they probably have different levels of whether it's violence or just unrest. But in your opinion, what are some of the risks? I think other than just having an uninformed public, or perhaps that is the biggest risk, and what that can lead to. In your research, what do you guys see as the biggest threats that come from people who are believing the wrong things?
Well, and we do always take into consideration that these are people that feel like what they're doing is right. And there are things to be worried about in this world. And we should all be concerned citizens about getting the information right. And one of the biggest concerns that we have is that all this disinformation that's arising in our digital environments is, of course, sowing confusion and creating larger and larger divisions in an already polarized society. But the biggest concern to us is that all of this will lead to even more distrust in the institutions that we rely on, like journalism, like government, like science, like university and higher education, like all these institutions, and on and on and on, that we have to depend on, that we depend on experts. And right now, there is a pretty significant decline in trust in institutions across the board. And that is a really concerning byproduct of all this disinformation that we're seeing in social media and more broadly. And that's why it's very concerning when we always, when society now points to everything as being fake news, that's can be a very damaging idea to these institutions. And I think when you look at some of the research and efforts examining disinformation campaigns, ones that have been labeled, and that's hard to do because disinformation is a collection of true and sort of false things. When they have been labeled and studied, they find that really the main objective for those studying this is eroding trust in institutions. And I think that's the thing that's really concerning. Of course, it's also concerning to me when the misinformation deals with people's health. There's been massive amount of misinformation, disinformation as well during the pandemic. And I think that's where it's example of this stuff is life and death when it comes to getting this right. And the problem is we're just seeing more and more of this disinformation. So we need to me, it's one of the most important things that we can address right now.
Well, maybe we talk about how we do that. I know you teach classes on teaching students how to be better consumers of news, how to seek out what's the truth, how to make sure they aren't buying these conspiracy theories, or that they're finding news they can trust. What are some of your tips for people?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's just getting people engaged on the topic, and we all can be better information consumers. So certainly there is an education component, and I'll list a couple tips in just a second, but it also involves, very importantly, local journalism efforts. And I know we can maybe talk about that in a second, David, but I think really reinvigorating local journalism is absolutely one of those antidotes to this. It's talking with policymakers, bringing these big tech platforms to the regulatory table, which I think is actually happening, and one of the few bipartisan efforts that might go on over the next couple of years. We need, the technology is too important to collective decision making. They need to be a part. This, society needs to be a part of that conversation. We also, need we need concerted efforts in regions across the United States and across the world. Right now, we have this new Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington, which represents all of Washington, where we're devoted to this research and teaching. But on the teaching side, when we teach it, I mean, some of the most basic things that we've learned even before this crisis of information or this infodemic have been things like just always ask who's telling me this, how do they know it, and what do they have to gain from it. So if you see something in a Facebook post, follow up that link, figure out who gave you that information. If you can't figure out who sent it, who owns the news site that sent you that, or if it sounds too good to be true or too bad to be true, continue to question it. Look in multiple places, triangulate, corroborate. Just ask questions, be proactive. And most importantly, if there's only one thing you do, it's to think more, share less. We always say pause before sharing, because it's in that sharing that makes this information go so fast. And it's us who share it, even us being, let's say, the citizens of the world that don't want to share misinformation. We're the ones that are sharing it, even if it's created from a different source, or if it's created from someone with good intentions, but is a mistaken piece of information. We're the ones sharing it. And so what I'd like to see, of course, is the social media platforms helping with that and downgrading, information from maybe people that are more likely to spread this kind of thing. But I think ultimately it comes down to us. So I think more and share less is one tagline we use a lot in the center. Of course, there's lots more sophisticated things people can do, and we have all sorts of lessons. You can go to our center website and our education material. Things like, for example, if you see an image that seems suspicious, you can do reverse image check. You can check sources by just putting the source and then space Wikipedia. And that sounds very basic, but these are the kinds of things that can help you sort of sort through these. It's just really applying what investigative reporters and fact checkers do all the time, and journalists all the time. It's sort of turning everyone into a journalist, because we're now required to do that, both as producers and consumers of information in this Web 2.0 world in which we live.
Yeah, I've used that. I think it was read more, share less when you first debuted.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. It. But I use that often. I liked that last year, and I said that a lot to people. Along this topic, on one of the interviews I saw, you talked about the emotional reaction to certain stories and the red flag that it presents us. I liked that because I think there are stories that are designed to provoke me. And what we do in our business, I don't believe we're trying to provoke with what we say. We're trying to get your attention, but you are trying to kind of put a little difference on those two things. So you can explain that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And newspapers have to sell to some degree. If you're not reporting on things that people care about, then of course you have to sell. So there is some attraction to that, but every business has it. Educators have it. Scientists have it. We have to sell our ideas so that we can get funding. Everyone is selling to some degree, but it's reached a level in journalism, certainly national journalism, where it's really about creating those emotional reactions. So when talking about tips, I should have included it. You didn't let me forget, which is super important, that if something gives you an emotional reaction, like it makes you mad, it creates fear, it sort of vilifies a group, or it causes some strong emotion, that's when you should pause even more than you normally would, because that's the kind of stuff that these algorithms are designed to do. And they use things like forward referencing headlines. You see this on CNN and Fox and MSNBC all the time, where they never tell you the story. They just say, check out what Bill Barr said today, or what did Bill Barr say today that, will shake your boots or something. If they don't say what the story is about. They're just there just to force you to click on that, because you just can't help but find out. So this clickbait that exists and these emotion evoking kinds of headlines and stories is really all due, again, to this advertising model that's overtaken the way that we deal with information. It's what runs the economics of the internet and big tech companies, social media. And that's not always good for society and the health of society when it's all about just grabbing our attention regardless of the news. In fact, these social media platforms are kind of the biggest BSers of all, because they don't care about what they send. They're just trying to attract your attention. So I would say look out for those. And I would hope that quality news sites that don't do as much of that clickbait, then those are the kind of places that I personally spend more time at. I think it's real disconcerting and sort of disingenuous by, to receive from these national broadcasters. A lot of the native advertising, it has all this clickbait and has all these emotion. When you leave, let's say, reading some of these news stories or these news sites, you don't leave feeling, like you learned something. You just probably are mad about something. And that madness then translates into some of this, I think some of this polarization too that we see in the country.
Yeah, I guess maybe I could just interject a bit and then lead towards something else you talk about, and that's the importance of local news. But from our perspective, the Kitsap Sun, and we're part of a larger newspaper company, but the goal of getting a lot of clicks is so much different than it was a decade ago for us. A decade ago, it truly was. We did not have a lot of viewers on our website, and so there was pretty serious. We were really focused on that number. It's rarely talked about anymore on our site. So I think that illustrates maybe the difference between what we're doing and what some of these sites that you're talking about, or what the platforms are looking for. We are dedicated to growing subscribers, and a subscriber is not someone who clicks on this wild story that then has no evidence in it, and they are not going to pay money for our content. We want people who return each day, read the news consistently. I've always said that a newspaper isn't any good unless you read it every single day, because you need to follow these stories. Not everyone is going to grab your attention and tell you everything there is, but by the time you've read the third installment, whether it's certainly a lot of topics, COVID, schools, things like that, you need to follow this. And so I guess I'm saying that to say our model sounds very different than what you're describing, and that makes me feel a little better about what you're doing.
Exactly. I mean, if I could, just turn some magical dials, those magical dials would be pushing us all more to subscription-based models. And in a subscription-based, as you say, you are committing and investing in this organization to report sort of a long-term, a full package, rather than just these bite-sized pieces of news that are in competition with each other, even within the same news sources sometimes. So that's, I think, really the world would be better off if we were in more of a subscription-based model.
It gives us, and I can't speak for every newspaper out there on how they acquire new readers, but it also gives us less incentive to do things dramatically on social media. Now, we use it. The Kitsap Sun Facebook page, we like to break news there. There's times we can use video in a way that we don't on our website, and we do reach new people. But if we know people are regular subscribers, that they may come to us directly through an app, directly through their e-edition reading, it gives us less incentive. And I think that's probably becoming a more traditional view in the established media, that we don't have to go reaching for new customers with something viral, but we know they know to come to us. We saw this between the smoke the last couple of weeks, COVID earlier this year, the Black Lives Matter movement, and all the protests surrounding it. When people when something was going on, they knew to come to us, and that was without us having to invent something. They knew there was big news. Come check us, and we see that in our numbers. So that's maybe the hopeful spin on this too.
Well, absolutely, and I've talked about this independent of talking to you, David. I mentioned it independent when we met last time, that I think one of the true antidotes, in addition to education, is really is supporting local journalism. And when you look at these trust indicators, there's lots of surveys from the Gallup poll, Pew Research Center, various other research groups and universities that do these trust experiments and surveys each year. And local journalism tends to be quite robust in terms of trust. That people, if you asked a random person in the United States, they almost always trust local journalism more than they trust national journalism. And I think there's a real opportunity there in a world of distrust to sort of build those relationships. And I think what hopefully we can do in the Pacific Northwest is try to be a model for that for other places, because there are places around the United States that have no local newspapers and no local news outlets at all. And if they are, they've been taken over by organizations that don't have any of the writers from that community. They're writing even sometimes outside the country. And so I think this is something that we have to address in the United States and probably around the world too, for sure. But certainly it's one of the things that I see. And it's not even my area of expertise. I look to my colleagues in journalism to have a deeper understanding of sort of current trends and what we can do. But I've been a consumer of that research and a lot of these conversations more and more over the last year with this new center that we have. And I just think it's so absolutely critical to be thinking about, and not just with, the editors and the journalists and the researchers and stuff, but with everyone involved on how we do this right. And there are some efforts happening right now, Pacific Northwest, that are going to be happening just this fall and conversations around this.
Well, is that something you want to talk about with us right now? What you're seeing, and maybe I'll follow with, or I could talk about what we're doing here.
Yeah, well, I would love to. I mean, this is an interview with me, but I want to interview you too, David. So, because I want to learn as much from you. As I said, this isn't my area of expertise, but it is an area I'm becoming more and more attached to. Tell me, from someone that does this day to day, first of all, what are you doing? Some of the adjustments, and you've already explained some, but what can we do more broadly in the area of local journalism around the country and here in the Pacific Northwest to bring that back, to bring that sort of at the forefront and reinvigorate that, to build trust?
Yeah, it's an interesting time for us in terms of this question. Even we are seeing, the strategy, like I explained, is to find new subscribers, and a lot of times those are digital subscribers. That's kind of a change in the industry, and it's going on all over the place. And we're finally getting to where that's a healthy number to sustain a newsroom. And so that has been a struggle for the past 15 years, is the steep declines in the print revenue, losing staff. And so we cover less stories than we used to. If you think about that, one reporter could average 5 stories a week, do the math, and that's a few hundred stories you're missing every year. And so the community notices that, and I feel bad about it. And I think it's led to the vacuum that gets at the heart of what you're studying, that when there are not as many local stories to grab your attention, let's say, that attention can go to something else that isn't maybe as relevant to your life, or something that I don't want to say should be reading, because I'm not a teacher here, but so we have a gap. And what we're finding is the digital revenue side is now catching up to where we can be a little more sustainable as the size we are. The question is, how do we grow that back to what it really needs to be to serve this community adequately? And every day we see a story that, man, if we only had one other person or 2 other people, we could get that. We could explain to this person the question they had. One thing I'm watching, and this maybe is on your list, is what the Seattle Times has done in terms of grant funding for several kind of very public interest topics. And homelessness was one, education is another, and traffic is the third. And I think they've done a good job of arranging these teams and getting money from either Boeing or Starbucks or corporations that have a vested interest in the community. The Knight Foundation that you mentioned, they've done this in a couple different places in the country too. So it's interesting to watch kind of a nonprofit model, a grant-funded model, to support particular positions. And that's something we're just embarking on here in Kitsap right now. We're going to try to launch some stuff at the beginning of next year, and we may turn to readers if we need to. And I think I hope they would feel good about that, supporting us in a slightly different way via subscription, but also if you'd like to give more to us, very specific thing that we think would be good for the community. Report for America is the other one that we're exploring. We've applied for some positions. And Report for America is this national nonprofit that's trying to place journalists in communities that are underserved and cover issues that are underserved. And so you apply to them with a specific topic in mind. You explain to Report for America, this is what we think we're missing in our community, what we would like to focus on. And then if they like that idea, they think it's worthy, and they have a reporter on their list that would match well, you partner together, we pay a portion of the cost, they pay a portion of the cost, and it's a way to get someone back into a newsroom. And then headed into the future, you then can fundraise to support that job. And so it's a mix of our business in a new way. And we're hoping some of these things work to start refilling our ranks.
I love that program, and I saw that they recently received another big funding grant to maintain that program. I think it's fantastic. It reminds me of Teach for America or some of these other things that really get everyone, involved around the country and sort of place them in different communities. It's very much about community engagement underneath the model. So I love those for sure. And so, when you look at, so you've been in the fortunate position to sort of be sustaining now, not at the growth you'd like, I imagine, but what about communities that have nothing now? What is there anything that they could do given your experience?
I think one method of success we've had, and it's I'm not going to pat my own back because I think our reporters sometimes do a much better job of it, but we've started doing a lot more things in the community. So the traditional sense of we write a story, you see a byline, maybe you know a reporter if you happen to be a source, or if you happen to call the newsroom a lot or write letters, maybe you knew who we were personally, but for a long time, that wasn't a big part of what our role was. The editor would go to the Rotary Club and he'd be on the board of these organizations. But to be very, very one-on-one with folks, and social media helps a little bit in that our reporters have got to know people. But what we also do is we have a reporter who's really good about hosting in-person events. And he's done this for several years now, that once a month, there's a news story in town. A lot of times they're kind of development things. There was a new walking path that was built in Bremerton, and he would bring people out and say, come with me, and I'm going to bring one of my sources with me so you can ask questions, and we'll stop and we'll explain the story as you experience it. That one happened it started with a group of 25 people taking a walk with him, and has turned into an event that 1,000 people come to. And we tell them, when you're there, we say, if you like this, you got to subscribe so we can keep doing it. And so unfortunately, COVID kind of scrambled those plans this year, so we've had to take a break, but we're hoping in 2021, we can get back on doing those again. And we know for a fact, people tell us they only subscribe to us because they enjoy those so much. And so it's a different idea that I think newspapers haven't done before, especially in a small community, that if they know you, if they know the person, you're more likely to spend $8 a month on a subscription. That's not a huge ask any longer.
I love that idea. And I'm going to share this with others when I talk to other organizations and at conferences around the country. I just absolutely love that idea. It's such a cool thing. One thing I want to mention that relates very much to the mission of the League of Women Voters too is this focus on voting. And so one thing that we've done in our center, I wouldn't say as creative as yours, because I just think it's so creative and I love that, was to really engage in a project around the election that monitors misinformation in real time. And it's something that I've been hesitant for several years to do real-time monitoring of misinformation, because it requires such an investment in time. But we've decided to engage in this collaboration with Stanford University and other organizations, something we're calling the Election Integrity Project. And the goal here is to monitor issues around election integrity, not monitor things like Biden said this and Trump said this, but to monitor specific news on social media and in the digital world more broadly around election integrity issues. So things like, for example, election procedure. So if someone sees in their news, in their Facebook feeds, on Twitter, or wherever they read news, if they see something that's misleading or even possibly misleading about the date of the voting, and we've seen many of those, of course, or about participation interference. So tweets, during the election or during the day of the election that says, the line's too long, don't go there when, maybe the line's too long, but that's sort of interfering with participation. Or of course, fraud, if people see things around fraud, and also delegitimization, both before and after. And so what we're doing with this collaboration is engaging with the community, digital volunteers. So with AARP and Doug Shadell, who runs the AARP in Washington, they're going to be our first civic society organization that's going to be our digital volunteers looking for this. And then that gets vetted through our center to monitor things around election integrity for this election and possibly other elections too. So I say to any listeners out there that are interested in how can I get involved and help, at least around this election and maybe elections in the future, we have now built a system where you can get involved and you can provide some of the input. So anything you see, you can email us, and then we'll sort of go through and sort of do some investigation within our center, and then ratchet it up to other journalists and other organizations so that people are aware of it, and let some of the officials that run the voting programs in the US to sort of be aware of these things. But if you're interested, you can just reach out to our Center for Informed Public at UW. It's uwcip@uw.edu. Just email us if you're interested, and we can get you on a list to join in on that. So I just wanted to mention that as sort of a pairing of that really creative idea that you had mentioned to David, and also relates very much to the elections and a lot of the misinformation and disinformation we're seeing around that right now. And of course, that's ratcheting up as we get closer and closer to November.
So maybe it leads me to a final question here. And I know you're a professor and a researcher, not a psychologist, but you gave us some tips earlier about what I can do as I read my feed or as things are passed to me, how I can judge, do I trust it, do I not, or where do I look for more? What do you say when I have the friend or the family member who's consistently sending me things that are just off base? How do I speak to that person? What's your advice on how you approach others to kind of keeping things civil with an election that we know raises the passions, but how do I do that?
It's hard, and we all have it. I have it. I have family members, friends, neighbors doing the same kind of thing. And so my advice, and I'm not a psychologist, and there's probably better advice out there even among the crowd right now, but it's just to approach it with empathy. There are people on the other end, and many times these individuals think that it's needed that I receive this information. And so a lot of times I will approach it in a curious manner, both empathetically and also with curiousness about it. Like, where did you find this? So this gets at the sourcing. How did they know it? Just in, kind of interrogating, not in sort of a lawyer sense, as my colleague Mike Caulfield says, but more as an encyclopedian or something. Sort of like, how did you find this? Where did it come from? Just start asking where that information came from, and try to have an open dialogue. Now, that takes time. And so you have to decide whether you want to invest that time, and if it's someone that you're able to have that conversation with. But I think we do need to have these conversations, when we can, because we are becoming, more and more divided in the US, partly by all, these reasons we've already talked about in this discussion, but various other kinds of reasons. And I think the best thing we can do is talk. And it's hard in this virtual world to talk because we behave differently in these virtual environments than we do in physical environments. So I think it's certainly going to help for us to be able to return someday into the real world. But I would say treat them respect. Don't attack them ever. Don't attack them as individuals. Ad hominem attacks don't work. Shaming doesn't work. At least I don't think. I think treating, going forward with empathy and curiosity is usually the approach that I take. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't, but it's a hard thing. And actually, it's a topic that we will start investing in our center. We don't have psychology expertise, but we're looking to recruit that and to focus on how people get radicalized too. It's an important subject, and there's not a lot known about. There are some researchers that have done good work on it, but I think more needs to be done in trying to understand that, especially in a world now where we're seeing more and more people online subscribing to these really damaging and concerning conspiracy theories, like the one we mentioned before. The QAnon conspiracy is a good example of that.
One thing, it's funny you say, earlier you said everyone needs to put themselves in the seat of a journalist. And so I think that's actually an interesting point, and maybe we need to do a better job explaining, but the tips you were just using is often what I use with letters to the editor. And there's no consistent theme, but people like to generalize in there, and you say, look, your letter could be better if you gave me a specific thing that you're criticizing.
Right.
So maybe that's a tip. And the other
I like that tip. It's a good point. Yeah.
Force someone to find that specific, because you'll convince me of what you think. And the other one that I've said to a number of people this summer, or groups, is it's very easy to get caught up, especially with like the protests that kind of went on across the country, that a national storyline develops about this side of it and this side of it. And I say, that's fine, but understand they're telling a national story. Make sure you look at what's happening in your town. Did you see violence in your town? Then maybe back off a sec on labeling everyone as violent. And so I always encourage people, look what's happening in your community when you start to make sweeping statements.
Yeah, and actually that's a perfect example of something that we had been tracking too online, where we saw a lot of, again, misinformation and disinformation around certain issues around the protests and around the movement on both sides of the narrative. And that was actually reaching all the way to local communities, small communities around the country. And a lot of times people were finding that nothing really ever showed up. And there are trolls on the internet, and there are bots, and there's opportunists that are pushing narratives. And because of their ability to gain influence during crisis events, they're able to push these things. And then people show up and find that that it wasn't the threat that was sort of described online. And I love this idea of saying, look at your community. What are you seeing? And because that's what you do know. A lot of times that we see reported far away is through a couple different lenses, and we all see. And sometimes when there are two narratives that evolve, sometimes they're even both right to some degree. I mean, if you look at COVID, for example, there was two big narratives forming and still sort of exist around, being extra careful and shutting down and mask and et cetera, on one side, which is important. And then on the other side, that economics do matter here. And there are some serious consequences to staying closed. I mean, there sometimes, at least the core parts of some of these narratives, they have some substance. And what happens is by sort of seeing that it is a complex situation, that there's more, it's more than just a sort of binary answer. Well, it's either this or this, and the others are vilified, at least how it's written in one form of media. I think that's kind of, we need to move past that. And I think, again, that's where you can retreat from sometimes those national conversations and retreat to your local conversations. And I think those tend to be more productive.
I would guess that the idea of holding those two concepts fits into your think more phrase, doesn't it?
That's right.
Kind of
and read more too.
Read more, think more, yes.
Read more, think more, yeah.
Well, Jevin, thanks very much for joining us today. That was great to talk about, especially some of the things you guys are doing that are very tangible and people can get involved in. And that's great. We'll share that email address and website. So if there are groups here in Kitsap who'd like to join your effort this fall and into the future, hopefully we can help you guys out. So I wish you luck, and hope to hear more in the coming years on how we solve some of these issues to create a better society.